All right. Last class, I mentioned the fact that I meant to have a schematic or a map or something of Jerusalem because as we're getting into Acts chapter 22, Acts 22 starts with Paul on the steps of Antonia. Antonia is the garrison of the Romans. And we mentioned that the way it's positioned, it is positioned on the mount where the temple is, set off a ways, but it was still in a place that was both in authority and yet at the same time to the side so as to not draw undue attention to itself. So that being the case, it wasn't down in the midst of Jerusalem, which is why the commander had to be told about what was going on. So here we see the temple. This is kind of the schematic for the temple. We see the Antonia fortress right here off to the side. So when Paul is in the middle of the temple, he's inside the temple during this vow or this oath at the time when the Asian or the Jews from Asia had come and were accusing Paul and so forth. They take him out of the temple, but I don't think they took him out of the actual grounds necessarily. I don't know for sure because it says all of Jerusalem was caught up in it. So whether they took Paul out of the temple itself and there was a big whoop-de-doo in the court or in the courtyard and people were kind of all hearing about it and gathering there, or they took him outside completely out of the courtyard and everything and had this big to-do going on here. The fact that at the end of Acts chapter 21, as we noted last week, that Paul was taken, he had to be carried, and they were going up the steps of Antonia. Okay, I tend to think that they were probably out here near Solomon's portico or something along that line. That's my thought process on that. I don't know that they had actually taken him all throughout Jerusalem yet. Sounds like the mob had gathered here. They were beating him here. And then when they heard about it, they come down, they grab Paul, they try to find out what's going on, can't figure it out because everybody's yelling. So they carry Paul up, and at the steps of Antonia is where Paul says, hey, I'd like to address them because this whole crowd is moving up to the steps of Antonia. That is my kind of how I'm processing the events of Acts chapter 21. Again, not to say that they couldn't have been in here. I mean, it would have been a much longer trek and certainly a much more perilous trek as well. This is another example. This is just the same thing. There was one in here I wanted to show you. Yeah, here we go. Here's one of them. So this is kind of a model of, like it's an actual real life model of the temple. And you can see Antonia back here in the background with the steps there. And then there's the temple proper, and here's the courtyard. And then, of course, you have the gates to the temple as well that we've read about in the book of Acts. And then there's one more here. This is the one I wanted to kind of focus on. This diagram is coming expressly from the writings of Josephus and the way Josephus describes how everything was attached to the temple. Again, these things no longer exist. All we have are remnants, for that matter, hardly that. Keep in mind, in 70 A.D., the temple and everything was destroyed. Okay, so we have very little in terms of actual archaeology to show exactly what it looked like. But I thought this was interesting. This is where Paul stood to lecture the Jews in Acts chapter 21. So we see the steps here. This is the temple site. Okay, this is the temple site. I know it looks a lot different. I don't think this is really drawn to scale. Okay, I know it looks a lot different on the other schematics, but this is the temple site and the courtyard around it, and then you've got stairs leading up, and this would be where the garrison or the base, or however you want to say it, of the Romans would be. This would have contained at least 1,000 men and would have had all the amenities that the Roman soldiers needed to be able not only to function there, but also, if need be, to withhold any type of riot or rebellion or anything like that. So, let's see. Any thoughts on the steps of Antonia and its situation inside Jerusalem? Okay. Before we get into chapter 22, I do want to take care of our questions real fast. We haven't discussed the questions of chapter 21 quite yet. Actually, we did do question 1 and question 2. Question 3, I'm not sure if I don't know if we actually finished talking about this. I know we had talked about it. But the Jews, we know that the Jews assumed that he had taken who into the temple? Trophimus. Was Trophimus a Jew or Gentile? Gentile. And as a result, that would have been a defilement of the temple, and based on their already perhaps twisted understanding, deliberate or not, of what Paul had taught regarding the fact that the temple doesn't mean anything anymore. It's not important to our service to God. They just assumed that he took Trophimus in. What important application can we make of this in our lives? Yeah. Judge judge not according to appearance, but according to righteous judgment, as Jesus taught in John. So the important thing is to get all the facts and then make your assessment, make your judgment based on the truth, not on your perception of it or assuming anything. And that's true in every walk of life, not just the spiritual walk, but physically in our world as well. All right. So we see here in verse 37, he asks the commander if he can speak to the crowd. It would seem as though he speaks to the commander in Greek, because when he talks to him, hold on, this one. Nope, this one. There we go. So when he speaks to him here, may I speak to you? He replied, can you speak Greek? Are you not? So it sounds almost like that's a rhetorical statement of surprise. He wasn't aware that Paul could speak Greek. He had assumed, and again, the commander doesn't know Paul presumably from anywhere. Okay, so when all this is taking place and there's this big hubbub and all this stuff going on, he links it to this thing a couple of years ago with this Egyptian, and there's not any information. I looked for some secular information, some historical information about this Egyptian who got 4,000 people together and went out into the wilderness, it says. There's not really any information on that. Apparently, though, it was a big whoop-de-doo a couple of years before this. And it seems like the centurion just assumed that this was Paul. Paul's, of course, that's not him. But he was surprised that, hey, I didn't know the information that the centurion is assuming about Paul doesn't fit with what he's seeing from Paul and hearing, in this case, from Paul. Paul says, I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, and I implore you permit me to speak to the people. When he says no mean city, it was a very important city. It was a city of learning. And of course, Paul had been taken at a young age and was raised pretty much by Gamaliel, taught about the law in Jerusalem. But he was born in Tarsus. Notice what is absent in verse 39. What does Paul not say? That he's a Roman citizen. Okay? I'm not saying that Paul was being deceitful in any way. That's not an applicable point to bring up at this moment. Okay? Paul is a Jew. He's not an Egyptian. Okay? That seems to be primarily what he's addressing. And the fact that he speaks Greek. Paul's of the dispersion, so to speak. He's from Tarsus. Okay? And this is a city that was important to the Romans. And this certainly is going to be part of his base to make the case for him to be able to speak to the people, that he can speak to them as a Jew on their terms. And so the point of him being a Roman citizen, Paul's not to that point yet of dealing with Roman policy. Okay, he's wanting to address the Jews. The Roman policy hasn't come up yet, which is why his citizenship hasn't come up yet. So Paul's not going to just throw that in there for no reason. And of course, with all the things going on, it might go completely, well, I don't think it would go unnoticed by the Roman commander, but with all the stuff going on, it wasn't the appropriate time. So, verse 40, when he had given him permission, Paul stood on the stairs, these are the steps of Antonia, and motioned with his hand to the people. And there was a great silence, and he spoke to them in the Hebrew language, saying. So this wouldn't have been ancient Hebrew. This would have been the variation of Hebrew that they spoke, Aramaic. Aramaic, a simplified way to put it is that Aramaic was basically modern Hebrew. It had some influences from other places as well. But for the most part, it sounds like he's speaking to them in their language. Okay, not ancient Hebrew, because keep in mind, we've seen examples already in the book of Acts where it seems as though the average Jew did not have an understanding of ancient Hebrew. Okay, the way that the texts of the Old Testament were written in ancient Hebrew and so forth. This would have been modern or Aramaic Hebrew. And so as he speaks to them, he's going to speak to them as one of them. Okay, he's not going to speak to them in Greek. He's not going to speak to them in some other language that they don't know, Latin. He's going to speak to them in Hebrew, and it's going to show, yes, he is one of them. I don't think anybody had an understanding that he wasn't a Jew. That was kind of the reason of the big thing going on. But he's going to approach this from the basis of, hey, I'm one of you. In fact, when we get into chapter 22, that's going to be the very first thing he's going to point out. I'm one of you. Okay, I'm just like you. And here's my experience. Here's what I've been through. Here's what I've been taught. In an effort to make the case for them to be able to listen and pay attention and hopefully to stir some hearts. It's not going to work. I don't say it for everybody. Maybe it did eventually work for some. But this is what Paul's efforts are going to be. Anything through chapter 1, or chapter 21, sorry. We're not going back to chapter 1. All right, chapter 22. So as Paul begins his dissertation here, sermon, dialogue, however you want to put it, brethren and fathers, hear my defense before you now. And when they heard that he spoke to them in the Hebrew language, they kept all the more silent. Paul had already gotten their attention, and now he's speaking in the Hebrew language. He's not going to speak to them. And keep in mind that for the Jews of the dispersion, speaking Hebrew may not have been their first language. Okay, if they knew that language, if they were able to speak it at all. The fact that they were of the dispersion, most of the dispersion Jews spoke Greek. Some of them may have understood certain parts of Latin depending on where they were and how much Roman influence existed where they were, like in Rome. But the odds were that Hebrew or Aramaic wasn't their native language. Okay, I'm sure they understood it, but that wasn't something that they spoke naturally. And so this certainly is going to keep their attention. He's approaching them from the perspective of a Jew. He says in verse 3, I am indeed a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, taught according to the strictness of our father's law, and was zealous toward God as you are all today. I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering into prisons both men and women, as also the high priest bears me witness, and all the council of the elders, from whom I also received letters to the brethren, and went to Damascus to bring in chains, even those who were there to Jerusalem to be punished. So Paul describes kind of his background. He says, let me tell you the kind of my credentials to be able to tell you why I'm saying the things I'm saying. The fact, remember what he was accused, there were 4 accusations in total against Paul. He speaks against the law. What else does he speak against? Back in chapter 21. This place, which would be primarily the temple, if not all of Jerusalem. He speaks against the temple. What else? There were the 3 big ones, and then the one that they happened to kind of throw in there because of what they saw. Yeah, bringing Trophimus into the temple. So against Moses, against the law, against this place, and and the fact that he defiled the temple by bringing Trophimus into the temple, which he didn't. But that's what they assumed that he did. That's what they're accusing him of doing. So Paul's going to provide this baseline, his credentials, which show, listen, I was raised just like you. His respect for the law, for Moses, for the temple, and for the purity of the temple. As a Jew, Paul was taught all of this. Okay, this isn't something that Paul just threw away willy-nilly, so to speak. So when he says here earlier, back in verse 3, notice he says, yeah, I was born in Tarsus, I was born of the dispersion, but he was raised where? In Jerusalem. Which makes Paul kind of a unique case in that Paul was both of the dispersion but also almost homegrown. Okay, remember there was a kind of a schism, a differentiation between Jews of the dispersion and a homegrown Jew of Judea. Okay, the homegrown Jews, the Judean Jews, kind of looked at the Jews of the dispersion as they were Jews, but they weren't really complete Jews. They were kind of like second-class Jews almost in a way. Okay, there was a kind of a looking down on them from the perspective of the Judean Jews who were there, who'd grown up around Jerusalem and so forth. So when Paul comes along, he's of the dispersion, but he's also of Jerusalem. He's able to speak to both, okay, which puts him in this unique position. He's able to address these Jews from Asia that were there for Passover through Pentecost, which is part of the reason Paul wanted to be there in the first place. But he's also able to approach the Judean Jews on their own turf, so to speak, as well. Not to mention the fact that I would imagine, even though at least 17 odd years has passed since Paul had left Jerusalem for Damascus, and then all that took place since chapter 9, I'm sure there may still be some Jews who remembered Paul, okay, especially as he starts bringing up the fact of all the things he did when he was with the Sanhedrin. Okay, notice he says he was brought up at the feet of Gamaliel. And I tend to think, this is just my thought process, is that at this point Gamaliel is no longer alive. Okay, as we get later on in chapter 22 and into chapter 23, if Gamaliel was still there as senior head of the Sanhedrin, I would tend to think that he would have stood up and said something. Okay, he did so earlier in Acts. Of course, that wasn't in context of Paul. But either Gamaliel is no longer alive or he has abdicated his position, becoming a Christian. I do think Gamaliel did become a Christian, regardless of whether he abdicated his position on the Sanhedrin. He may have been forced out and whatnot, but either he's not alive, he's definitely not a part of the Sanhedrin at this point. But Gamaliel was still highly respected, okay, regardless of what happened to him. He was still highly respected. He was a teacher of the law, and he was kind of an elder spokesman, so to speak. It sounds like he was one of the oldest in the Sanhedrin. His words carried great weight. We saw that earlier in chapter 4 and chapter 5 of Acts. So we see in verse 3, how that Paul says, I was raised to be a Gamaliel. I was taught according to the strictness of our father's laws. I was zealous toward God as you all are today. I think that was true on the basis of the fact that they believed what they were saying. Not that that was accurate, but they believed what they were saying. In that they were overzealous. Okay, they were overzealous in assuming Paul taking Trophimus into the temple. That's not based on fact. That's overzealous. Paul says, I can in Romans chapter 10, they have a zeal for God, but it's not according to knowledge. Okay, that zeal, they have a passion, they have a fervor to serve, but they're not serving according to truth. They're serving according to their truth. Is really what it's about. And you see that kind of here when Paul says, listen, I was zealous toward God just like you. You're overzealous in that it's not being coupled with knowledge. But anyway, that's the basis upon which their actions are motivated. Verse 4, I persecuted this way to the death. And of course, this way is a reference to the Christians, the church, the teaching of Christ and Him crucified. I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering into prisons both men and women. Again, we talked about this earlier in chapter 9, and in fact, we talked about it in chapter 7 as well. The fact that nowhere in Scripture does it actually say Paul physically killed anyone. Okay? That's not to say he didn't, and I know, but that's one of the things that sometimes is taught almost traditionally, is that Paul killed Christians. But the Scriptures don't say he killed them. He voted against them. Okay, he cast his vote, his lot against them. That's one of the things Paul mentions that he did. Whether that was part of the Sanhedrin, I tend to think he was a junior officer of the Sanhedrin. Okay, and apparently he was able to cast lots along with the rest of them to be able to determine if this person should be put to death. He bound and delivered into prisons both men and women. So when he says he persecuted the way to the death, again, it's no reason to say that Paul personally brought about the death of people. except that he took these people, he delivered them to prison, and then the lots were cast against them. Okay, keep in mind that it was only when the Jews got almost too emotional and too caught up in the things that were being taught at times, like with Stephen in Acts chapter 7, that was when they tended to forget, hey, the law applies here, and they just kind of did vigilante justice. All the other times, they tried to follow the law. They tried to, anyway. Okay, it was when their emotions got up that the law went out the window. So when it came to these Jews who were of the way, they followed protocol. Okay, they followed the law, at least as far as we know. Okay, again, except in these cases where they just couldn't put up with it and that was it. So when Paul says I persecuted the way to the death, it's not to say that he personally went about, killing people. I know, Paul, when he describes himself in 1 Timothy chapter 1, the way he was before, at no point does he ever say he was a murderer. Okay, he says he was violent. He says, there's a lot of different descriptions he uses of himself, but he never calls himself a murderer. Did he beat people? Would he abuse people? Possibly. In order to get them into submission, to arrest them and so forth? Possibly. But it's not necessary to assume that he killed people himself. That's the point I'm trying to make. So, verse 5, as also the high priest bears me witness. Interestingly, and yes, that is true, verse 5, the high priest, especially at the time, could bear witness to the fact that Paul was indeed sent to Damascus to bring Christians back to Jerusalem to be sentenced. All of the council of the elders, obviously Paul was not a part of the council of the elders. This would have been likely where Gamaliel would have been part of the council of the elders. There were hierarchies, so to speak, in the Sanhedrin. And you had your junior members, I guess you could say, your younger men, which I think Paul would probably have been a part of. Then you had your elder statesmen, the council of the elders, that their voice had carried more weight. They were more experienced, more knowledgeable, and so forth. From whom I received letters to the brethren, went to Damascus to bring in chains, even those who were there to Jerusalem to be punished. So Paul says, this is why I went to Damascus. This is what happened. And he's going to get into what happened when he was going down the road to Damascus. Anything through verse 5 so far? All right, verse 6. Now it happened as I journeyed and came near Damascus at about noon, suddenly a great light from heaven shone around me. And I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? So I answered, Who are you, Lord? And he said to me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting. So when Paul recounts this, and of course we have the actual account that Luke gives us back in chapter 9, and then this is going to be accounted again to Agrippa in chapter 26. All of this information is going to help us to have a full understanding of what took place. When Paul says, a great light from heaven shone around me, he says, I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Okay, this dialogue that he has with Jesus, and that's why he identifies who it is, verse 8. Who are you, Lord? I said, and he said to me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting. It's interesting to me that between verse 8 and verse 9, the people still seem to be willing to listen. Okay, as soon as Paul mentions Jesus of Nazareth, is talking to him in a bright light, that would automatically imply that Jesus of Nazareth, we killed this man. Forget, these were the people, at least, at the very least, their fathers killed Jesus, put him on that cross, and remember, it was said about this situation later that the disciples had stolen the body. He didn't rise from the dead. His disciples stole the body. Okay? But they're still listening. Between verse 8 and verse 9. All right? This recounting of this in verses 6 through 8. Any thoughts on that before we get to verse 9? Okay, verse 9. Paul says, And those who were with me indeed saw the light and were afraid, but they did not hear the voice of him who spoke to me. Now, between verse 9 and then chapter 9, verse 7, Luke tells us that he doesn't mention the fact that they saw the light. He doesn't contradict that either. Paul says they did see the light, but they didn't hear the voice of him who spoke to me. Luke records in Acts chapter 9 that they heard something, but what? They didn't understand it. Okay, they didn't understand it. And we talked back when we discussed chapter 9, there were two possibilities. Either God simply prevented them from understanding it, okay? They heard garbleness, and they weren't allowed to hear the actual words that Jesus was speaking, or Jesus was speaking perhaps Old Hebrew that Paul might have been familiar with, having been raised in the law, knowing that language, at least the written part of it, whether or not they also taught him the spoken part of Old Hebrew. It's possible that he was speaking to Paul in that language, and they couldn't understand that because they weren't taught Old Hebrew. Either one, pick one. But either way, you put Acts chapter 9 with this account, we know that they saw this light, they were afraid of what was happening, they heard a noise, but they didn't know, there was nobody around to attribute the talking to. I mean, they heard a voice, but they had no idea what it was saying. And so that's what Paul's recounting here in verse 9. Verse 10, so I said, what shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said to me, arise and go into Damascus, and there you will be told all things which are appointed for you to do. Since I could not see for the glory of that light, being led by the hand of those who were with me, I came into Damascus. It's interesting, though, that the others, did they have any problem seeing after Jesus left? After the light went away? So Paul was exposed more so to something than the rest of them. He was allowed to understand the voice, whereas the rest of them weren't. He received such brightness, whereas the rest of them perhaps they saw the light, but that glory of that light was not such as it was for Paul. And Paul says, I was blinded by that. And of course, we read in Acts chapter 9 the account, when he opened his eyes, he couldn't see. Okay, he couldn't see anything. And when he gets to Damascus, of course, and Ananias comes and heals him, what falls off his eyes? Something like scales. Yeah, something like scales. So whatever process that took place during this event between Paul and Jesus, it left him not being able to see. And Paul says, I could not see for the glory of that light. Verse 12. Anything through verse 11? Verse 12. Then a certain Ananias, a devout man according to the law, having a good testimony with all the Jews who dwelt there. Why is that important? He could have just said a certain man who was, a Jew, came and talked to me. Okay, he's speaking their language, and could this be verified? People in Damascus, can they verify having known Ananias? Or for that matter, especially the Jewish Christians, and Ananias, I don't know if he was still alive at this point, but I mean, this is information that was specific. It's not like Paul's making it up, okay? The specificity of this was Ananias. He was a devout man. According to the law, he had a good test. People knew him. The Jews knew him. Even though he was a Christian, the Jews understood that this was a good man and he had good testimony among them. He came to me, verse 13, and he stood and said to me, Brother Saul, receive your sight. And again, Brother Saul, was Saul already a Christian at that point? Is he saying this as a brother in Christ? As a Jew. Which goes to say that Christian Jews and non-Christian Jews, was there still a basis for commonality? They were still Jews. Okay, it didn't change their social status from as being a Jew. Granted, the way they identified themselves was mired in their religious worldview of themselves as the people of God. But Ananias still considered Paul a brother. Okay, Paul recounts his love for Israel throughout several chapters in Romans. How much he loves, and how much, for that matter, God loves Israel. Okay, and Paul's prayer was that Israel would be saved. So, he stood, said, Brother Saul, receive your sight. And at the same hour, I looked up at him. So he was able to heal him. And of course, that was one of the gifts Ananias had been given, apparently. Verse 14, then he said, the God of our fathers has chosen you, that you should know his will and see the just one, and hear the voice of his mouth. For you will be his witness to all men of what you have seen and heard. And now why are you waiting? Arise and be baptized and wash away your sins, calling on the name of the Lord. So, as Ananias recounts to Paul what the Lord told him to tell Paul, again, we read earlier in chapter 9 about some of that dialogue between Ananias and Jesus. And at least in what Paul recounts here, he doesn't tell everything that we know of the dialogue between Jesus and Ananias. Ananias talking about, Lord, don't you know who this is? And perhaps the other information that was a part of that. You will be his witness to all men of what you've seen and heard. Is Paul literally fulfilling that right then and there? In that moment, was he literally doing part of that? Yeah, he was testifying about what he had seen and heard right then and there. Arise and be baptized and wash away your sins, calling on the name of the Lord. We've talked about verse 16 a lot, and verse 16 is very important. It's crucial as a point of discussion to describe the necessity of baptism and what it does. The fact that it washes away sins. People want to focus on Romans chapter 10 and verse 13, call on the name of the Lord and you shall be saved. Okay. That calling on the name of the Lord, though, isn't just one act, it is a process of actions. That's why you call on the name of the Lord. What's a part of calling on the name of the Lord? This is a process that has taken place. It culminates in being baptized for the remission of Paul's sins. That's the idea of washing away his sins. He doesn't say, arise and be baptized because your sins have been washed away. That's not what Ananias says. Did I see a hand somewhere over out of the corner of my eye? I thought I saw a hand. Yes, sir.
I didn't have my note at all.
Oh, okay.
Back to Ananias, like you were mentioning the comment about that he was a Jew earlier, an devout Jew according to the law. Doesn't that also fly in the face of the charges that they're bringing against Paul? That here's a man, he was a devout Jew, but he was also a Christian. Paul isn't teaching against the Jews because here's an example of a guy who was a Jew, and yet he told me what I need to do to be saved, to convert to this way.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point. The fact that Ananias and his example was one that he could be in harmony with all the Jews as well. The fact that he had a good testimony, there was nothing from especially from a social perspective, or I say social, from a civil, thank you, that's the word I was looking for, from a civil perspective that was contradicted by what Ananias was doing as a Christian. Okay, the two could be in harmony, one as the spiritual law of Christ and the other as the civil law of Moses. Those two can go hand in hand. And the fact that Ananias had respect for the law and all the Jews could testify to that, that means that Christians aren't automatically against the law. Okay, that's not what Christians are about. So to presume that Paul is, or to take his words, and again, whether or not they deliberately did it, Paul says that they were being zealous. You can do a lot of things in the name of zeal, either deliberately or unintentionally. So whether they twisted Paul's words deliberately or just based on their filter, the things that they heard automatically meant this. Okay, either way, they presumed that because of what Paul believed and in fact taught, automatically meant this, oh yeah, and that he brought Trophimus into the temple. And so certainly, yeah, this lends kind of a backdrop for Paul to make the case. These accusations aren't accurate. Anything else to verse 16? All right. And of course, and again, if you write in the margins of your Bibles, I don't know how common that is nowadays. I know back when I was growing up, everybody was doing it. But if you do, make a note of verse 16 and then link it to Romans 10:13 about calling on the name of the Lord. This will help us when we have somebody, because Romans 10:13 is one of those re-quotable bumper sticker type of things, calling on the name of the Lord to be saved. And a lot of our friends, neighbors who are religious, this is kind of one of their mainstay verses that they go to. Romans 10 is in its own context. It's not so much about how to be saved, it's about why Israel can't be saved. why they won't be saved if they continue to hold fast to the things that they do. And so you put that in connection with Acts chapter 22 and in verse 16, and it will help us to be able to describe that calling on the name of the Lord isn't just saying the sinner's prayer. It's not just, saying, Lord, please save me. It's not accepting Jesus in your heart. There is a process that took place. Paul accepted Jesus into his heart on the road to Damascus, didn't he? I am Jesus whom you're persecuting. Did he accept Jesus in his heart right then? I tend to think so. He believed Jesus was the Christ, Son of God. At that moment, he's raised. Okay, Paul, there was a sense in which Paul had this dialogue with Jesus. Did that make him saved? No. It wasn't until he was willing to be baptized and wash away his sins that process of calling on the name of the Lord was concluded to be saved. And of course, then after that, you have the faithful life that we must live as well, which sometimes gets forgotten. We talk about 5 steps of salvation. Technically, there's 6, right? There's 5 steps to become saved, and then the one after that to remain saved. All right, anything else in verse 16? Verse 17. Now it happened when I returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple that I was in a trance and saw him saying to me, make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, for they will not receive your testimony concerning me. So I said, Lord, they know that in every synagogue I imprisoned and beat those who believe on you. So notice verse 17. It happened when I returned to Jerusalem, I was praying in the temple. I don't know, in fact, for those of you who have the, I might even have a copy of it here somewhere, who have the copy of the Paul's journeys, let's see, where did I put that? Nope. It's ironic. I put it on the website, but I don't have it here. There it is. That's my written version. We don't want that one. Here we go. Which visit to Jerusalem specifically this was, whether this was his first visit back. We see that first visit back in at the end of Acts chapter 9, right here, having come from Damascus. Remember, he was received. Barnabas had to kind of go to the apostles, convince them to accept Paul and so forth. Whether this was that event specifically in chronological order, it would seem that that's the case. Okay, I tend to think that that's the case. But it also could have been after that journey from Antioch of Syria back to Jerusalem in Acts chapter 12, could also have been an occasion where this took place as well. But Paul doesn't specify which visit to Jerusalem this was. But I tend to think that given the fact that Paul's in context of talking about the early years, so to speak, I tend to think it was that first time back to Jerusalem after having been converted. I tend to think. So he was praying, and notice he was praying in the temple, okay? Again, the accusation of, you don't care about the temple doesn't mean anything anymore. Yet Paul, after he'd become a Christian, had gone to the temple to pray. Did he do that out of scriptural necessity? Was it a spiritual obligation that he has to pray in the temple? Why was he praying in the temple? Why was he praying in the temple? What did the Jews do? They prayed in the temple. Okay? There were certain hours during the day that they were the hours of prayer. Okay? We have a hymn called the Hour of Prayer. All right? And that's kind of a borrowing of what the Jews did. They had times during their day that were set aside for them to go and pray. Paul was in the temple praying, and he says he was in a trance, or kind of like similar to what we see Peter in Acts chapter 10, having this vision, this trance being given to him about the sheet with the clean and unclean animals. It sounds like this is something similar. It's not a dream. Paul's not making it up. It's not like it never happened, and the same thing with Peter. This is a vision or trance that Jesus has sent him. And he saw him saying, make haste, get out of Jerusalem quickly, for they will not receive your testimony concerning me. Which is to say, they're not going to believe you. Okay, they're not going to listen yet. So I said, Lord, they know in every synagogue I imprisoned. No, he says, I beat those. He said, it doesn't say I killed them. Going back to my earlier note. Yeah, he says he was violent. Did he take times where he hurt people? Sure. He beat them who believe on you. And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, of course this goes back to Acts chapter 7, and this is how we know this is the same Saul/Paul as the apostle. I also was standing by consenting to his death. I was fine with it. Okay, he wasn't just fine, but he was in approval of it. Okay, the fact that he held the coats or took care of the coats also shows that he wasn't a senior member of the Sanhedrin. Okay, if he, as a junior member, or even at that point as just an officer of the Sanhedrin, he wouldn't have taken part in the killing of Stephen anyway. That's why he says he was standing by consenting to his death. He wasn't one of the ones that helped kill him. Those would probably have been the senior members of the Sanhedrin involved in that. Not to say Gamaliel was. And I'm not necessarily sure that all of the Sanhedrin were always of the same mind all the time. I'm sure men like Gamaliel might have said, hey, listen, what happened to the law? Okay, Gamaliel was a voice of wisdom, and I don't know where Gamaliel's voice was in all of that, but regardless, he was guarding the clothes of those who were killing him. Then he said to me, depart, for I will send you far from here to the Gentiles. So he mentions the fact that he was telling Jesus, this was me. I was there, I had a hand in Stephen's death. And the Lord tells him, depart, I will send you far from here to the Gentiles, which goes again to lend itself to that first visit to Jerusalem, because it wasn't until after that he had what we call his missionary journeys, the 3 missionary journeys. If it was as of Acts chapter 12, even then in Acts chapter 12, that's chapter 13 is the beginning of his first missionary journey, but you still have some events taking place between chapter 9 and chapter 12. Where Paul's, going about, he's learning, he's growing, he goes up back to Tarsus, teaching the gospel. So, again, pick one. I tend to think it was probably that first visit to Jerusalem. So notice specifically, what's the last thing Paul mentions? Gentiles. Okay, there are 2 major buttons for the Jews. Okay, one was, Jesus. Okay, and to that end, okay, Jesus and the temple. Okay, remember Stephen brought up both, and then you also have the Gentiles. Interestingly enough, that in Acts chapter 7, what was the last thing Stephen started talking about before they were killing him? Yeah. But before they started, not specifically before they started stoning him, but notice as they were stopping their ears and they're rushing at him, in verse 51, notice he talks about being stiff-necked and uncircumcised. You have received the law by the direction of angels, have not kept it, verse 53. They were cut to the heart, they gnashed at him with their teeth. And notice verse 56, look, I see the heavens open, the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. That's it, they're done. And so that idea of Jesus and the resurrection, and remember what was contained in the lesson from Stephen? He talked about the temple. God does not dwell in temples made with hands. All right? Well, here, Paul ends talking about the Gentiles, and what's that going to do? Yeah. He talked about Jesus. Okay, Jesus is raised, same thing that got Stephen killed. And he's going to talk about the Gentiles. And the Gentiles, that was one thing that the Jews did not want to hear discussed. I'm going to send you to the Gentiles? No. All right, that's where we'll stop. Acts chapter 22. We got pretty good ways here in Acts chapter 22. So we'll pick up there next Sunday. Thank you, everybody, for the thoughts and comments.